We are keeping a close eye on a volatile situation in the Middle East, where U.S. forces across the region are bracing for possible retaliation after airstrikes against Iranian-backed Houthi militias in Yemen. On Thursday, U.S. and U.K. forces struck dozens of targets, more than 60, at 16 different locations across Yemen. That's according to the U.S. Air Force. Houthis say that at least 5 people were killed in the strikes. The attacks are a response by the U.S. and its allies in what has become a slow-simmering crisis that has drawn the administration's attention in the last few months. Since the conflict began hundreds of miles away in Gaza with the October 7th terror attacks, Houthi forces in Yemen have been launching missile and drone strikes on ships in the nearby Red Sea, site of one of the most crucial shipping lanes in the world. Back in November, Houthi forces even hijacked a ship that was operated by a Japanese company. The Houthis say their actions are in support of Hamas in the ongoing conflict in Gaza, and they say they will continue their attacks until Israel ends its campaign. Just moments ago, President Biden answering questions from reporters. Take a listen.
I've already delivered the message to Iran. They know not to do anything.
Will you continue bombing the Houthis if the attacks don't stop? Will you continue with the strikes, sir?
We will make sure that we respond to the Houthis as they continue this outrageous behavior, along with our allies.
Ever since October 7th, fears have been rising that the United States will get embroiled in a wider regional conflict with Iran or its proxies and allies scattered across the region, groups like the Houthis. Here's what National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby had to say about that earlier today.
We're not looking for conflict with Iran. We're not looking to escalate, and there's no reason for it to escalate beyond what happened over the last few days by the Houthis. They are the ones that have been escalating. We're not looking for conflict with Iran. That said, we know that Iran supports the Houthis. We know that they supply them with the missiles and the drones, the same things that they've been using to attack shipping. And we have made it very clear Iran should stop that support. We have in the past and will continue to hold Iran accountable for the support that they give, not only to the Houthis, but to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and their militia groups in Iraq and Syria. And we're going to do that in concert with our allies and partners.
And that is where we start today with NBC News national security and Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube, plus former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama Ben Rhodes, and retired 4-star general and MSNBC military analyst Barry McCaffrey. Courtney, let's start with you. What is the state of play in the region right now?
Well, some people in the region, including Iran, not surprisingly, who back and support and bankroll the Houthi militia in Yemen, they have condemned these strikes. But some, like the Saudis, Oman, and Turkey, have also condemned the strikes, claiming that they could potentially escalate some regional tensions. That being said, one of the major reasons that the U.S. conducted these strikes when they did last night was because they were waiting until they could build more of a coalition. The U.S. did not want to go it alone on these strikes. So what we saw last night, Alicia, was the U.S. and the British militaries coming together to carry out what I have to say was a very large-scale attack against Houthi militants. We're talking nearly 30 different locations, more than 60 targets, and more than 150 precision-guided bombs and missiles launched at various Houthi sites throughout the Houthi-controlled part of Yemen last night. So a very large-scale attack here. But what the U.S. was trying to do for weeks since they first started putting together potential targets for attack late in 2023 was to build more of a coalition here. So it was the U.S. and the British last night, but they also had a number of other nations who supported in a non-operational role. So they weren't actually dropping bombs. They weren't necessarily flying planes, but they were supportive of these strikes last night. And we actually heard from President Biden today when he asked if the U.S. would continue to target the Houthis if their attacks continue. He said yes, in conjunction with allies, the U.S. would continue going back and forth. But of course, that's not what the U.S. wants here. They don't want a tit for tat, but there was increasing pressure for the United States to respond to now more than 24 attacks by Houthi militants into the Red Sea. Alicia, they've been mainly one-way attack drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. And while the majority of them have been unsuccessful or knocked out of the sky by the U.S. military, several have struck commercial ships. And that's the real concern here. It's starting to have an impact on the global economy, with major companies rerouting their ships down around southern Africa at additional cost with additional time. And the concern here is that it's going to impact consumers when some of these shipping companies start passing the additional cost onto the prices back here at home. But in addition to that, as these Houthi attacks have become more and more aggressive, we saw one Tuesday with more than 20 projectiles, U.S. officials are increasingly concerned that they could have an attack that is successful. If it were to hit something like a U.S. military ship, that would have the immediate impact of really drawing the U.S. more directly into the regional conflict there, Alicia.
Courtney, any signs of retaliation from the Houthis?
So far, there actually has been one that a U.S. military official here today said they believe was a retaliation for the strikes last night. The Houthis fired off a ballistic missile into the Red Sea. Again, it's a very busy shipping area. No ships were struck. That was not shot down. But so far, that's it. I have to say, I mentioned the massive number of strikes overnight, 150 different missiles and bombs. What we should really be watching for here is whether this really was able to degrade the Houthis' capabilities and whether we see them have to sort of reassess their ability and maybe have to take a step back to sort of regroup before they might even have the ability to carry out more attacks in the immediate future, Alicia.
Courtney Kube, thank you so much for getting us started. General Barry McCaffrey, I want to go to you. Help us understand why the administration would decide to launch airstrikes.
Well, I think there's such an economic cost to global shipping coming through the Suez Canal. At some point, they had no option. We've seen a couple of thousand ships now diverted around Africa. It's 12% of all global shipping comes through the Red Sea, headed to Europe or in the other direction. So I think the administration built a coalition, got a UN resolution of support, got active participation by 20-some-odd allies, and then conducted a moderate strike. It's very difficult to destroy ground combat capabilities with air power, but it's more effective when you're going after radar, coastal, sea-based drones, storage sites. So I think they probably had an impact. I don't believe the Houthis can possibly be deterred. What we can do is wind down their capabilities. To do that, it may well require a couple of weeks of unrestrained air power strikes.
Ben, let's put this in a more global context. Let's talk specifically about the Houthis. This is from the New York Times. They have built their ideology around opposition to Israel and the United States, seeing themselves as part of the Iranian-led, quote, axis of resistance, along with Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Their leaders often draw parallels between the American-made bombs used to pummel their forces in Yemen and the arms sent to Israel and used in Gaza. Once a group of poorly organized rebels, the Houthis have bolstered their arsenal in recent years, and it now includes cruise and ballistic missiles and long-range drones. Analysts credit this expansion to support from Iran, which has supplied militias across the Middle East to expand its own influence. The U.S. has been dealing with the Houthis for years. Walk us through that history, Ben.
Well, the history is that the Houthis have become, even back in the Obama years, they're becoming a stronger and stronger force that was holding more and more territory in Yemen, and even at times threatening the capital city of Yemen. The Saudis then launched a war into Yemen towards the end of the Obama administration with the backing of the United States to try to destroy the Houthis. And I think it's an important point to build on something General McCaffrey said. I don't think you can do that. Multiple years of war in Yemen created a humanitarian crisis. But it did not dislodge the Houthis. And if anything, they seemed to prove their resilience and their capabilities grew stronger. So they are going to be there. They're not going to be eliminated as a fighting force. And it does seem like they're also not going to be deterred because they have an ideology of resistance. And having lived through war, I think they're willing to take a lot of risk and to take a lot of hits. And so this really is mainly about maybe sending a message to Iran and maybe degrading their capabilities. I think the other important thing here, Alicia, though, is that the retaliation might not just come from the Houthis. We could see Iranian-backed militias in Iraq threaten U.S. forces or U.S. diplomatic personnel there. We've seen attacks on U.S. forces in Syria. This already is a regional war. The heart of it is in Gaza, but we've seen fighting and bombing in Lebanon. We've seen it in Syria. We've seen it in Iraq. Now we're seeing it in Yemen. I think it goes to show that so long as the war simmers in Gaza, you're going to have these fuses that could be lit in different parts of the Middle East. The administration is trying to do two things that are in some tension here. They're trying to deter that escalation, while at the same time, their tools for doing so are escalatory in nature. And that's a very precarious place to be.
Well, General, talk to me about that tension, the possibilities this administration could be preparing for.
Well, first of all, I fully agree with Ben's points. This is a strategic dilemma the United States in, and the Biden administration, particularly Secretary of State, has been very creative trying to prevent either horizontal escalation to new places of conflict like the Houthis, or vertical, where we finally would get Hezbollah entering the fray with 100,000 fighters. We don't want to see a regional disaster. The U.S. does have substantial military power in the region. And at the end of the day, this is being orchestrated, by Iran. That's who's more than 130 attacks on U.S. military forces in both Iraq and Syria. Now the Houthis, the Iranians just seized an oil tanker out in the Persian Gulf. They allegedly just attacked a vessel carrying chemicals out in the Indian Ocean. So they're steadily moving the bar here. At some point, we're going to have to threaten military action privately against the Iranians. No one wants to see that, to include the Iranians. They have a lot to lose if this thing escalates to include strikes against them by either Israel or the United States.